Hello and welcome to this lecture on available data. After this lecture, students will be able to identify and describe the types of available data, explain the strengths and weaknesses of available data, and describe how to analyze available data. First of all, what is available data? Available data is any sort of data that is easily accessible to the researcher. It can be primary or secondary sources of data, so primary data meaning you go out and you look for this data via movies, TV shows, historical documents, etc. Or it can be secondary data that someone else has collected and that you are using. This data can be using existing statistics, summaries of data collected by large organizations, historical documents, etc. Here are the main types of available data or existing data out there. There's public documents and records, private documents, mass media, physical nonverbal materials, social science data archives, and big data. Let's start with public documents. Government record keeping and bureaucracy is an important source of data. Governments collect all sorts of data such as vital statistics, which includes births, deaths, marriages, and divorces, things that are stored in the court documents. These sorts of vital statistics are available to the public for the most part. The Census Bureau is also a large store of public data, but there are smaller databases through which other agencies such as the CDC, the Public Health Institute, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, etc. gather data as well. And there's data from local level as well. Your city, county, state will collect data as well. The manuscript census is individual census records that are released 72 years after initial collections. So the full census becomes available 72 years after it's collected. So a census that was collected in 2020 will not be fully publicly available until 2092. However, the census will release what are called public use microdata samples, or PUMS, which are smaller, anonymized, random samples that are drawn from the census. We can always access aggregate data from the census when it's available. Private documents can be anything from letters or diaries from individuals, or meeting notes or minutes from organizations, but also includes things like websites, sales, inventories, tax records, college transcripts, etc. Basically, private documents consist of the things that are not necessarily generated by the government or public agencies, but are instead generated either by private companies, organizations, or individuals. Mass media is another important source of data and can include things like internet, magazines, film, television, radio, newspapers, anything that is put out by a media company, including social media. Social media is a huge source of data. And so we can do a lot with those sort of mass media, from looking at how people are talking about a particular event or phenomena on Facebook, to looking at how racial or ethnic minorities are portrayed in movies and TV shows. Physical or nonverbal evidence is fairly rare in sociology, but is more frequently used in history or archaeology. So this can be things that are like art, clothing, household items, bones, archaeology, finds, etc., and is again used mostly in anthropology and history. So we might be able to say use art to make inferences about society or culture, or use a midden heap to understand what ancient peoples ate or drank. Next, we have the social science data archives, which includes things like the General Social Survey, which is a survey of the United States population that's sampled every 2-ish years, and it's been sampling since 1974. The World Values Survey, which is similar to the General Social Survey, but it does it for the world, so you can compare how people respond in the United States to how people respond in Italy, Argentina, the Philippines, South Africa, so on. And the ICPSR, which is a database where people in sociology, political science, economics, psychology can submit their own data for others to use. So if I go out and collect a sample and get a survey from a group of people, I can submit it to ICPSR so that other academics can look at it and use it. This sort of data archives are repositories of data that are collected by other researchers, by agencies, using grants, etc. And some sort of public access is allowed. You may have to pay for that privilege, you may have to access it through your university, but you are able to get access to it in some way. Usually this is survey data, because survey data is very good for secondary analysis. But we have to be careful when we're using this sort of survey data because we need to make sure we know how other people have collected it. And it's sometimes difficult to understand how data was collected, coded, and analyzed if the documentation is poor. With any sort of available data, we want to make sure we understand where that data is coming from, how it's coded, how it's been entered and stored. And so we have to be particularly careful here if people aren't clear on how they collected this data. Lastly, we have big data. Big data is something relatively new that we see coming up with the social media data that's collected about you, Google data that's collected about you, Twitter, Internet Archives, etc. There's so much data now out there from what TikTok, Facebook, Reddit, X or Twitter, all these companies collect data about you and then sell it. And there's billions of users for these platforms, and they're collecting data on you every day. And so this is just a mountain of data. And it's really shifted how particularly marketing companies and these big companies use data. Unfortunately for us, this means that a lot of our data is getting collected and used to sell us things. But also, we don't really have too much access to this because there is so much sophistication needed and computational power needed in order to analyze this sort of data sets, because we're talking data sets with billions and billions and billions of cases and billions of variables. So what sort of methodological issues might we run into using available data? Well, the issues we have with available data are that we have to be able to find data. We have to be able to find the data we're looking for. We can't make it ourselves necessarily, so we have to be able to find it. And then, even if we find it, we have to check, does it measure what we want it to measure? Are we able to have good measurement validity with this data? We also have to check if the data is trustworthy. If we're using someone else's survey data, one, is it measuring what we want it to measure? And two, can we trust that it's been collected and analyzed appropriately? And we have to ask, is this data set complete? Or is there something missing? When it comes to finding data, we have a number of good sources to start with. As always, it's a good place to start with government records or public documents that are easy to access. From there, we can kind of follow a paper trail if we need to find better or more reliable sources. But other good places to start are large international organizations or federal agencies, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Center for Disease Control, Federal Reserve, etc. These are good places to start because they typically have fairly trustworthy information and that information is publicly available. Other types of data may be more difficult if it comes from private documents, big data, historical documents, other survey data that's collected by people, because we're going to have to go in and check, one, is this data complete? How is it collected and coded? What sort of editing has been done to it? We have to go back and make sure that it is good data and data that we can trust. In addition, when we're using available data, we are not always going to find data that perfectly matches the concepts we want to measure. And we may need to take multiple measures or multiple different sources of data in order to make sure we have complete measurement of our concepts or that the measurements for our concepts are appropriate. So it's kind of like this idea that the shoe may fit, but not always well, and we may have to cobble together different sources of data in order to get a more complete picture. As I mentioned earlier, when we find data, we need to be able to reconstruct how the data was collected, coded, and stored. And this is especially true with historical evidence. In fact, historical data a lot of times has been collected and coded in a different way than it would be today. And so a lot of times with, again, particularly historical data, it's best to have more than one source for your information in order to corroborate your data. So if you can get multiple sources to agree on the same thing, then you'll feel much more confident than if you are getting multiple different stories from multiple different sources. And part of this issue, particularly with historical information, is assessing how complete it is. Data is rarely, if ever, complete, and that's because only certain things get deposited, survive, and are retrieved. And what that means is that selective deposit, for example, represents a problem where some people are not able to contribute to documentary or physical evidence. People who write history are typically more educated, are wealthier, and the people who are poorer tend not to get their histories written. In addition, selective survival takes a toll when some objects or documents survive and some others don't. And maybe there's a fire, maybe stuff gets lost, but some stuff is going to survive and some stuff isn't. And that's going to present a problem of completeness for us, the researcher. And finally, how we, the researcher, chooses to find and retrieve information is going to also present a bias. If we're only looking in online databases, we're going to miss the physical evidence that may not be online. Despite these difficulties, there are a number of strengths of available data. One is that it's non-reactive. It is not going to cause respondents to react to it because it's already been collected. It already exists out there. So there's going to be no reactivity effect of you taking that measurement. Two, it allows us to have a longitudinal analysis of social structures, organizations, and governments. We can see how governments, agencies, people have changed over time. And in fact, available or existing data is the only way we have to study the past. And it's a good way to study how things change over time and compare across cultures, geographies, countries, states, etc. It also makes it easy to replicate and increase sample sizes. If I already have data out there that I can use, I can easily find more, hopefully, and replicate these studies to get larger sample sizes. It can also save us time and money. Again, the downsides here are that it may be difficult to find data that fits your exact needs, the data can be difficult to access, and it may be hard to assess how complete the data is, if there's a bias in the data, and whether there are any issues with the data collection, coding, or analysis. Alright, that's all for this lecture. Thank you for watching.